There's two 13-year-old girls underneath those blankets. They slept outside last night. Too funny. So I'm actually sitting outside today to work. I've got my outdoor table, which arrived yesterday. So nice to have more than one place to sit and work. I haven't snapped much about work this week. I have been doing work, but not as focused as usual because it's school holidays and Jess has a friend visiting, Kiera. It was my birthday, so I took a day off, and we've also had a bit of running around to do with a health scare with Jess. Nothing serious, or at least we're not taking it as serious at this stage, but she's been getting these palpitations which got a lot worse, a little kind of burst rapid heartbeat, which have gotten more frequent this week. I didn't know about them till a couple of days ago, so we've had to deal with that. So, for instance, this morning, had to have blood tests, had to go and get this monitor thing fitted to her that she has to wear for 24 hours. So I've kind of been working a little bit between the cracks this week, and my main focus has been the Social and Collaborative Learning Essentials course that I'm facilitating for the AITD, and this is almost the end of week 2 of that program. I have spoken before about this course, which is running on a platform called Curatr. So it's 8 weeks, we've got 8 different topics there, and in each week there's a set of resources that have been curated from the internet. There's a resource that is in a window, and then there's a discussion question that pops up to generate discussion amongst the participants. This is my second time facilitating the course, and what I found was I needed to refresh the content the first time I ran it. I had a slightly different emphasis, probably a more practical, applied bent than the previous facilitator. There was a little more theory in there, and I wanted to shift the focus of some of the topics. This time round, I'm refreshing the content again, but there's one unit I found that I basically rebuilt all of the content. And I'll share about that inside after I'm finished the last 2 units that I'm working on, where I don't have the wind and a bit of background noise. All right, there's one resource I really want to share. This is a set of podcasts, Julian Stodd, about trust, power, and how communities actually work, how trust builds in networks. And I have shared this with people several times in the past 3 to 4 weeks because I think some of the ideas that Julian shares are just so powerful. So if you're interested in these topics, you can go to the Training Journal podcast on SoundCloud. They've actually got a playlist with basically 3 15-minute interviews. They've broken a 3-part, or they've broken a longer interview, a 45-minute interview, into 3 parts. Now, there's 2 key things I'm looking for here that I want to point out to the participants, and once I've found where they are, I'll give you a heads up on that.
Respect, a flow of knowledge,
I've got a friend here. Bella's sitting here listening to Julian Stodd with me, aren't you, Belle?
Now, the other major research
on the daybed. I'm loving this location. I picked part 2 of the podcast interview where Julian Stodd talks about research that he's done on communities in the national health system in the UK and how they actually work. It's great to actually be able to access real data on this. And what Stodd's research found was very interesting from the perspective of someone who is keen to find ways to support and enable people to interact in high value communities inside and outside organisations. So most of the high value communities people nominated were not communities the organisation had set up, but communities that had formed naturally, where a lot of the conversation was around improving processes, doing things better, where people were invited or introduced to the communities, and a key factor for how well the communities function was the way people were welcomed into the community and made to feel a part of the community. One other interesting bit was around the technology that was being used. So wait for it, shadow technology, yes. There were 17 different tools apparently that were being used across the people surveyed, and nearly all of them were shadow tech. They weren't tools officially sanctioned by the organisation, which ties in nicely with a piece of research I found last week by Cognizant, Cognizant, which talked about 21 future roles in organisations, and one of the roles it talked about was It was something like Shadow IT Facilitator, about taking Shadow IT and incorporating it with other tools being used in the organisation and integrating it into the tool set that the organisation uses rather than fighting against it. I haven't done a daily dispatch since early last week. Things have just been a bit frenetic, but I think I found the topic for today's daily dispatch, and I'll make the effort to do it because I've got to get back into the habit. All right, this last one is a practical topic, so there's no resources associated with that. That's all about everybody on the course pulling together their thinking from these previous topics to create a social learning strategy for their organisation. So I've done the resources now for everything except for the strategy section. I've refreshed the resources. So the one I put the most effort into was this one around on-the-job and face-to-face social learning. I really wanted to make this very practical and to make the point that social learning is not all about online and what happens in the technology, and in fact the face-to-face component is really important because it still tends to be in some ways kind of a richer relationship building experience. And I've found often, if I'm trying to form networks and communities or support people to do that, to form networks and communities, that bringing them together for some face-to-face activities, particularly early in the bonding period, is really critical to forming relationships that they can then build on. So what I've tried to do is pull together resources that cover a range of contexts for face-to-face social learning. So the first two are around social learning as part of a blended learning strategy, so perhaps more formal or scaffolded learning that happens in the context of a program, a learning program. Then I moved on to mentoring and an interesting piece of research around on-the-job training, looking at how social learning theory can inform practical approaches to on-the-job training. That was interesting because that one is about 30, almost 40 years old, but I think still very valid. And then a couple of less structured or less formal approaches, the idea of knowledge cafes, plus conferences and how to support people to make the most out of conferences. And then finally a couple of pieces that are a little bit more theoretical and ask some, I guess, more conceptual questions that lead into practical. All right, I'm going to leave it there for snapping for the day. I have a stack of little odds and ends. I'm just looking at my weekly plan on the wall. So I need to try to tie up a few other odds and ends, and I'll finish curating the resources for the last unit over the weekend sometime. This is Bella's first foray out onto the grass. Her immunisations are now complete and we can take her outside for the first time. And it looks like she's pretty happy down there with the girls. Oh, this is going to make life a bit easier for us.